Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Okay, well, welcome to Allow Us to Explain from Our National Conversation. I'm your host, Olivia Lewis, and I'm a journalism intern.
Hi, I'm Alex Julian, a podcast intern here at Our National Conversation.
On this episode of Allow Us to Explain, we're talking about nuclear energy. So our guests, if you'd like to introduce yourselves, please go ahead.
I'm Nirthi. I'm a moderate writer intern.
Jessica, go.
I'm Jessica Lovering. I'm the executive director and co-founder of a small nonprofit research group called Good Energy Collective.
And I'm Edwin Lyman. I'm a physicist and director of the Nuclear Safety Project at the Union of Concerned Scientists.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for being here. Some general background knowledge. What is nuclear energy? Nuclear energy involves splitting atoms in a reactor to heat water into steam, which then turns a turbine to generate electricity. This process occurs without carbon emissions since reactors use uranium as fuel instead of fossil fuels. And just a little fun fact, nuclear power plants operate continuously, providing around 20% of the nation's electricity in the United States. So for our guest, from your experience, how much does Gen Z know about nuclear energy?
From my experience, because I am in Gen Z too, so I would say it didn't really, education on nuclear energy isn't very common. I'm sure in schools they teach it when talking about chemistry, but really most of my knowledge is from my own research. And I think as a whole, our generation isn't that too aware about it. But then it's not really a big deal, but I'm sure people who are climate activists and who generally do research are well educated about it. But as a whole, there's not much knowledge in my experience.
Yeah, I would say I'm not as tuned in with how much Gen Z knows about nuclear energy. I have some touch points. I have a niece who's Gen Z, and she's interviewed me a couple of times for class projects on nuclear, so she's probably better informed than most. But looking at the polling, I know one thing I have seen in the data is that Gen Z is much more supportive of nuclear energy. That doesn't say how much they understand the technology, but compared to my generation, to older generations, boomer generation, the views on nuclear are much more negative. So Gen Z seems to be more open to nuclear, and there's definitely a lot more easy to access information available now through social media, whether good and bad, and how accurate that information is definitely up for debate. But I know there's TikTok influencers that educate on nuclear energy, and that's maybe helping. I haven't seen studies, but I'd be curious to hear if that's making an impact on Gen Z, but it is out there.
Well, I think the major problem, and obviously in the current information landscape we're in, it's very hard to be able to obtain objective information and to understand its provenance, understand who's providing it, understand their rationale for providing it, understand who pays them to provide it. And without all that information, nuclear energy, which is a very controversial topic, or it has been historically, is very subject to distortion, to manipulation on the part of readers or partakers of information. And so it's of a lot of different areas these days where the research people do really has to be tied to an understanding of who's saying it, where the information is coming from, and why, because it is so subject to manipulation by moneyed interests who are trying to win over the hearts of the public for a technology that's traditionally been not necessarily a favorite. And from my perspective, uh, nuclear energy is safe until it isn't. It is prone to catastrophic accidents, but those are relatively infrequent. But when they do happen, and that's Chernobyl in 1986 or Fukushima in 2011, when they do happen, people understand the power and the potential hazard of nuclear energy and why it has to be controlled so rigorously. But the problem is that after the years pass, people forget, and the nuclear industry is all too anxious for people to forget and to stop talking about these things. And the problem is when you're dealing with a technology where you have this risk of catastrophic accidents, but they're low probability. The problem is you just don't know how low they are. You can be lulled into a false sense of security. And that's what I'm afraid is happening now. I'm afraid that the polls that Jessica is referring to reflect perhaps a forgetting of the implications of nuclear power and the possible role of influencers who are influencing for reasons that aren't completely objective, and that's a concern.
Just to push back a little bit, I think, one thing that is very different in terms of what's driving a change in perception, a big one is climate change. And that's what's motivating a lot of these influencers or activists towards nuclear. Sure, of course, there's some that are, working for industry, but a lot of them are just, representing their own passions, their own interests. They think nuclear is important for mitigating climate change, and that's what's motivating them. And
How do you know that?
Because I know who they are. I know, their struggles. They're, not wealthy people. They're just doing this on a shoestring, from their living room. And I know that they're passionate about climate change. And I think that's, sure, there's some forgetting. I wasn't around when Three Mile Island happened. I don't remember Chernobyl. I've certainly, am well read on the topics and the impacts of those events. But for my generation and for younger generations, the big existential crisis that we worry about is climate change.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for those answers and getting this conversation going. Actually, kind of what Jessica said, 41% of Gen Z cites global warming as the most important issue facing the world. So quite a bit of Gen Zers are concerned about global warming. So when it comes to that, what role does climate change have when we're discussing nuclear energy? And we can go the same order we just did.
Well, for climate change is part of the reason that nuclear energy is even being discussed, because our current way of generating energy isn't sustainable. Emissions and global warming and everything that comes from greenhouse gases. So we are trying to make a switch and figure out a more sustainable way to generate energy. And so that's where nuclear energy comes in. However, along with that comes environmental concerns, such as radioactive waste, and then also the potential for things to go wrong, as others just discussed. And we're still dealing with the impacts of things like Chernobyl. So it's really about balancing, it's more sustainable, from a present perspective, but then in the future, if things go wrong, and also radioactive waste, you can also say that it's not sustainable in the future.
Yeah, as I just said in my previous answer, I think concern for climate change is a big driver of interest in nuclear, especially now and with the current generation that's going through college or finishing college. When the big fleets of nuclear power were built in the U.S. and Europe, there wasn't that concern around climate change. There was barely a concern about air pollution. The big driver then was the huge growth in demand for energy and electricity. And nuclear was valued, similar to a coal plant or hydro plant. It was large scale baseload power that was powering economies, powering industrial activity. But now the motivations really changed. I mean, you still have that drive in places like India, China, Japan, even South Korea, of needing very large amounts of electricity to power industry. And so that's still motivating their interest in nuclear today, especially for countries that don't have domestic fossil fuels. But for places like Europe and the US, it's really driven by the need for zero carbon electricity. And we have a lot of sources. I'm not saying nuclear is a silver bullet. We have wind and solar, we have batteries coming online, but all the modeling shows that you really need a mix to keep the grid stable, to keep the lights on. And it's much easier to reach deep decarbonization, sort of full decarbonization of the energy system if you have nuclear as an option. And that's what people are saying. It's not just driving interest in nuclear power, but we're seeing this in a lot of engineering programs across the US, is that there's a boom in people enrolling in nuclear engineering departments, and it's really driven by interest in climate change.
And from our perspective, again, the issue is complex, and oversimplifying, unfortunately, for the social media conversation that we're referring to leaves out a lot of the subtleties. Now, I think Narati, if I got your name right, is exactly right here. It's a balancing of risks and benefits, and you have to look not at the entire spectrum of low carbon sources of power, of which nuclear is one, but one with unique risks, not only the safety risks I was referring to, but also the risks of nuclear proliferation, because the same fuels and facilities that make the fuels for nuclear power plants can also be misused to make nuclear weapons. And that's one thing that one detriment nuclear power has that renewable energy technology simply don't. And when you have to look at that whole spectrum, and you also have to take into account that nuclear power is expensive. In fact, it's the cost of especially new nuclear power that's been one of the main reasons why it is not launched. And this is not the tying nuclear power to mitigating climate change is not new. The industry has been trying to make that argument for decades, trying to attract more interest. It's only happening now, I believe, because a few very wealthy individuals have decided to essentially risk their own money on nuclear power projects, whereas the government and private industry have not been willing to do that. But you have the extremely wealthy individuals like Bill Gates who don't care if they lose a few $billions, and so they're prepared to risk it. And that, I think, is disproportionately driving the increased interest in nuclear. But again, you have to look at nuclear power in the context. Is it the best alternative to provide low carbon power, given all its risks and costs compared to alternatives? And it's really a judgment of people's values. You have people who conclude that you have to have nuclear power, that you can't decarbonize without it. There are other modeling outcomes that show that maybe you can do it if that's what society wants. But it's in the nuclear energy industry's interest to make people think that nuclear power is indispensable. And I think it's because they're actually terrified that nuclear power is going to become obsolete, that renewable energy technologies, the costs are coming down, they're easier to implement, they're faster to implement, and as a result, nuclear power may become a dinosaur, and I think the industry is running scared. And so that's why they've launched this communications effort to try to convince people otherwise.
I don't think it's as I don't know, ill-intentioned as that. I know a lot of people who work in the industry. I will say our organization does not take any industry money. We want to remain independent and unbiased. But knowing a lot of people that work in industry, most people I know love renewables and are excited about the growth in wind and solar and see nuclear as a great way to complement those resources. I live in California, and we've just had a big turnaround on nuclear policy with our governor, who's been very anti-nuclear for a long time. Thought we'd never change the policy, but the realities of operating a grid in a densely populated state, even with advances in grid management and balancing, with huge penetration and growth in renewables, it's hard. And we've seen this not just in the US. The Biden administration has invested a lot of money in advanced nuclear technologies and new demonstrations, but other countries like Sweden had a nuclear phase out on the books, and they've reversed it because they just can't, keep their lights on without their nuclear power plants. And they've extended the operation, and now they're talking about building new plants. Similar in Japan, who you think after Fukushima might have, good reason to move away from nuclear power, but they just don't have other options. They're too urban, and they don't have a lot of land area suitable for renewables. And so they're right now accelerating the restart of nuclear power plants and even talking about building new nuclear. And so it's, I think there's a lot of people whose hearts are in the right place. And it's not just industry that's pushing this. It's a lot of, climate scientists and grid modelers who are saying, if we could do it without nuclear, sure. But it's really hard to do without nuclear. And I think that's something that more and more policymakers are starting to realize, and more private investment as well. Nuclear companies are raising a lot of private investment. You mentioned Bill Gates, but there's tons of venture capital.
It's really being driven, again, by a handful of very wealthy individuals. And again, nothing you've said contradicts the proposition that, it has nothing to do with people's hearts. It really has to do with largely cold, hard cash. And as a longtime observer of this industry and the way it operates, that there's very little, it's not people's intentions that really matter in the end. And again, is it being based on the facts? Are the people are they doing their own research, the entire spectrum of issues, understanding where the assumptions are and where maybe all the information is not completely transparent, and making their own decisions? And I don't feel like there's a level playing field right now with regard to information and power, raw political power.
Well, thank you again for your answers. I'm going to pass it on to Alex for our next segment.
On the topic of nuclear waste, Wired reports that melting ice sheets could be form of U.S. nuclear projects in Greenland and the Marshall Islands. With new information coming out about nuclear waste, how will Gen Z respond?
Well, let's put it this way. I think, from polling that I've seen over the years, nuclear waste is one of the issues that the public finds most concerning about nuclear power. And the fact that in most countries, they've been generating nuclear waste, which occurs as a matter of normal operation. When you run a nuclear power plant, the fuel becomes highly radioactive and eventually can no longer be used. And at least in the United States and many other countries, is just piling up. And the experts since the 1950s have always said, well, disposing of this material is not a technical issue. But unfortunately, in most countries, again, with a couple of exceptions, there's been no real progress. So when the public looks at that, they see an industry that hasn't really lived up to its promises. That said, though, nuclear waste disposal, the problem is that nuclear waste is very long-lived. There are components of nuclear waste that can be radioactive for hundreds of thousands of years. So you can't leave it sitting on the Earth's surface forever. But there are approaches where it could be where the risk could be reduced, mainly by a deep geologic repository, essentially burying it securely hundreds of meters above the Earth's surface in a stable geologic formation. But the problem is that because of the concern about waste, and in this case, some misunderstanding about its risks, those options have been largely opposed by the public. And for instance, the United States now had a program for decades to establish a geologic repository in the state of Nevada that was called Yucca Mountain. That engendered lots of opposition on the part of the state and some local communities, and eventually it was killed politically on the federal level, and now we have no alternative. And that's, it's a larger systemic problem. It's not just the industry's fault in this case, but the fact remains that there is no clear path forward right now for that geologic repository in the United States and a lot of other countries, and that's an obstacle.
Yeah, I think this is a point where I'll agree with Ed that it was a very poor process that went into citing Yucca Mountain in Nevada. I think, there's lots of procedural injustices there, but the big one is that Nevada doesn't have any nuclear energy, and they were getting saddled with the burden of storing that waste. And that's just not, doesn't look fair, wasn't fair. And eventually the state gained enough political power to get the project canceled. I think where we've seen success in citing deep geological repositories, the process looked very different in Sweden and Finland. It was much more of a consent-based citing process, which is kind of the gold standard now for citing difficult things like nuclear waste repository, where you build in a lot of benefits to communities for hosting, and you look for people to volunteer. They're not volunteering naively. There's a lot of feasibility studies and geological studies and educational activities. But there are communities that are willing to take it, for proper compensation. And if they have trust in the process and in the safety of the facility, it's a good deal for them. And so this is what the US is starting to implement for a repository in the US, but it's going to be a slow process because they want to get it right. So there's a award out right now for a bunch of consortia. Our organization, Green Energy Collective, is one of them, from the Department of Energy, looking at capacity building for developing a just and equitable process for consent-based citing of interim storage of spent nuclear fuel. So it's slow, but we've seen it done well in other countries. And then the other thing that could help is recycling. There's actually still a lot of energy in that fuel. Other countries reprocess, recycle their fuel to use some of it again for getting more energy out. Just last week, the US announced a pilot program to start recycling some spent fuel in the US and also getting medical isotopes out so things like for screening and cancer treatments.
So reprocessing is a technique where spent nuclear fuel from nuclear reactors is subject to a chemical process that separates the radioactive components from each other. In particular, it separates out plutonium. And plutonium is an element which is generated, again, when uranium fuel is irradiated in a reactor, it's generated as a byproduct. But the problem with plutonium, if you've seen Oppenheimer, is that it can also be used in a nuclear weapon. And so if you have spent fuel from the power plants we have here in the United States, that plutonium is very hard to access. It's dilute, it's protected by the other radioactive elements in spent fuel, and it's very hard to reuse that for nuclear weapons. But reprocessing actually is intended to purify that plutonium in a form where it can be used as fuel, but also can be used for nuclear weapons. So reprocessing, in my view, is a very dangerous technology. In fact, it doesn't do anything to solve the nuclear waste problem. In fact, it generates multiple radioactive waste streams, each of which are harder to manage than the original fuel in the first place. And you still need a repository at the end because you still have long-lived components of the waste that have to be isolated. So, and it's also super expensive. So it's dangerous, it's dirty and expensive, and it actually distracts the focus from what we need to do, develop a political process for a long-term repository, because holding out this false promise that reprocessing will solve the nuclear waste problem is very counterproductive and dangerous in my view.
I don't think it's a false promise. I think I agree with you. We still need to move forward with a deep geologic repository. I think it's something that folks are interested in, and there's growing interest in it because it can increase the sustainability of nuclear fuels. Most other countries do recycle, reprocess. Japan, France, they have very strong safeguards. But the big nuclear countries, and it can be done very safely and securely with proper, international
where I have
inspections.
to disagree, because it's a dangerous process. You're taking solid radioactive waste, which is relatively stable. You're turning it. You're releasing radioactive gases. You're releasing radioactive effluents. It's a mess, and I think you're making a mistake in continuing to advocate for it, because I think ultimately it'll undercut any effort to develop a really safe option for nuclear waste and ultimately decrease the credibility of the industry.
Well, I disagree. I think the process can go in parallel. And there's also new technologies, new ways of reprocessing fuel from advanced reactors that doesn't separate out the plutonium. And I think we should be pursuing those methods as well, because I agree if we can recycle and reprocess the fuel without separating the plutonium, that would be ideal.
Well, actually, those alternatives do not reduce the proliferation risk. And I served on a National Academy of Sciences committee, which put out a report in 2023, and perhaps we could provide the link in the reference materials with this podcast, because that explains very clearly what these alternative technologies are and their failings. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like I don't have too much experience with reprocessing and all the alternatives, but I feel like currently, like this whole process of nuclear energy being sustainable now, but then in the long run might not work out. I feel like that can also be translated to reprocessing, because as of now, out of most radioactive isotopes, I think plutonium has one of the longest half-lives, I believe, of around 2,400 years. And so
24,000 for plutonium-238.
24,000, sorry, yeah, 24,000. So then I think the incentive to separate that and reprocess it is a lot more, because it'll solve your short-term issue. And if it has all these side effects, and it's, as Edwin said, dangerous, and as of now, there aren't really any alternatives. I feel like people will gravitate more towards that because it's solving a short-term issue right now.
I'm going to turn over to nuclear energy and environmental justice. Nuclear energy has a complex history with issues of environmental justice, as nuclear plants have disproportionately impacted disadvantaged communities. Something I've learned in college is environmentalism, and how sometimes they put, dumpster sites next to poor neighborhoods or neighborhoods of people of color. Do you think that might happen again with nuclear energy, just environmental justice issues with nuclear energy?
So if I can go first, because this is, what my organization focuses on. We're very focused on the environmental justice implications and legacy of nuclear. And it's a complicated question, because there's definitely a terrible legacy of uranium mining on indigenous lands in the US and abroad. A lot of that was for the military weapons program, but also for the energy programs. So definitely on the fuel supply, that was a big issue in the US. For power plants, it's actually quite different. So for the most part, polluting power plants like coal, oil, those tend to be located in under-resourced communities and communities of color and low-income communities. But nuclear power plants actually tend to be located in whiter and wealthier suburban communities. And so that's very different. But again, that's not just, because the benefits, the jobs, the tax revenue is going to whiter, wealthier communities. But the negative sides, the uranium mining, at least in the US, and the risks that come with that and the pollution that comes with that, are on marginalized communities. And so that's definitely something, and this is driving interest in recycling, is if you can get new fuel for nuclear reactors without fresh mining, that's very attractive. But there's also much stricter standards on uranium mining today in other countries. And we don't really do uranium mining in the US anymore, for a lot of reasons. But if you look at environmental justice and environmental impacts of uranium mining in places like Australia and Canada, they have really good support from their native communities. They're very involved in the business side, and so things have changed, but that legacy is definitely there. And that is definitely a concern with siting a waste repository as well, is how do you have a just siting process that has informed consent and equally or equitably distributes the risks and benefits.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. You said that maybe it's changed, because I was looking at a study from 2018, and it said there's a larger percentage of African Americans living in within a 50-mile radius of nuclear power plants, and then a large percentage of whites living outside of that. But then again, it's been 6 years, so I think
so. That is true, that stat. But what's tricky is that nuclear power plants tend to be in very urban locations. So it's something like 50% of the US population lives within, 50 miles is a large radius around a nuclear power plant. And when you get into more granular data, the closer you get to the power plant, the wider and wealthier it gets. And so on average, 50-mile radius, that's a huge area. That is more African Americans than outside of 50 miles. But if you look at smaller increments, it gets sort of wider, wealthier, lower unemployment the closer you get to the power plant, which is the opposite of what you see for a coal power plant.
Okay, that's interesting.
Well, actually, you have to understand one of the reasons nuclear power plants tend to be located they have to be located on bodies of water, on the seacoast, on rivers, on lakes. A lot of those are also prime real estate for vacations. So there are a number of power plants where there's expensive real estate nearby because they're on scenic lakes. So some of them were created for the nuclear power plant. But that says very little about the actual environmental justice implications of nuclear power. The fact is, nuclear power plants are hazardous facilities, like coal plants, like chemical plants. Again, the risks are different. If it's operating under normal conditions and with strict attention to running it in a way where it's not abnormal, the radiation releases are relatively low. I mean, they're regulated. They're not zero, but they're low. But the concern again is catastrophic accidents or a terrorist attack that could cause a catastrophic release of radiation. And so there are risks associated with those. And those risks, as we look to the future and siting new nuclear power plants, it's more than likely that those plants are going to be sited in communities where they don't have the political power, they don't have the economic power to oppose them. And it's hard to imagine that those new sites are going to be distributed in any way equitably, so that the risk is distributed equitably. I mean, one thing that the nuclear industry has been pushing is to take smaller nuclear plants and put them closer to urban centers. These are the urban centers where disadvantaged groups are concentrated, and that trend may well upset the apple cart and pose an even bigger environmental racism burden on this country.
So I disagree. I think the industry has learned a lot from siting, but something you do see is that the communities immediately around nuclear power plants are much more supportive of the technology than the general population. We see this in polling, and that's the opposite even for wind and solar. I'm going to say I'm a big supporter of renewables. I think we need a lot more of them. They're really helpful to decarbonizing, to phasing out fossil fuels. But we are seeing, and even just this year, there's been several big studies that have come out. There's really strong and growing opposition to the siting of particularly large wind farms and utility scale solar. Something like a third of counties in the US have some sort of restrictions, prohibitions on wind or solar or both. You're seeing a lot of, genuine community opposition. You're definitely seeing fossil fuel funded, astroturf movements as well. But there is a lot of genuine opposition because wind and solar are so land intensive. They take up a lot of space and, they affect a lot of people. And so the nuclear industry, at least the new projects that are going forward right now, have done a lot to engage communities, to find communities that are interested. They're not saying, we want to build here, we're going to convince you, we're going to, push this project through. We're saying, they're saying, we want to build in this area. Are you interested? Are you interested? Let's talk. Let's fund some feasibility studies. Let's talk with your unions. And they're finding communities that are interested. It tends to be in more, places that have coal power plants retiring, that are looking to diversify their economy, maybe reuse a brownfield site. But it's very different than how nuclear power plants were sited in the past, which I do agree was done in this decide, announce, defend kind of method.
Well, I will move on to U.S. regulations with Alex.
The House just passed a bipartisan legislation that the Atomic Energy Advancement Act to speed up development of nuclear energy. Will this legislation have any impact on Gen Z's nuclear energy views?
I don't know how much Gen Z's political views are based on legislation passed, but we have seen a ton of bipartisan legislation pass with really wide margins in the last 10 years around nuclear. So there's definitely bipartisan support at the federal level. I think this bill, I was just looking up this number for a talk I gave this morning. I think that passed by something like 365 votes to 36 votes. So that's a huge margin in a very partisan divided House. So the bill does help to try and accelerate deployment of nuclear, and I think it'll help. It also has some programs to help reuse brownfield sites like coal power plants. So I don't know how it'll affect Gen Z, but I think it's a positive piece of legislation.
There was a survey done, and I think around 80% of Gen Z was like on the fence about nuclear energy. But so, I mean, I don't really know how much this legislation would affect their views, but from my experience with social media and all of that, Gen Z is pretty active, like environmentally active, and what they're passionate about, they're very passionate about. So I think those who are very passionate and educated about this topic, depending on what they think about it, if it's good or bad, I generally feel like it'll be a big deal for them. But for, I think, most of the generation, I don't really know how impactful it'll be, because right now it's not a really big topic.
Well, the bill, the Atomic Energy Advancement Act, is really just a grab bag of special interest provisions that were mostly put in by industry lobbyists over the years. But it has one very, very damaging provision, which we're very concerned about. And if you look at the history, so originally nuclear power, both military and civilian, was overseen by the Atomic Energy Commission. And this was created after World War II, after the Manhattan Project. One of its early directors was Lewis Strauss, who's the arch-villain of the Oppenheimer film. The Atomic Energy Commission was very secretive. It did everything really under behind a screen, and it was responsible not only for promoting and developing nuclear energy, but also for overseeing and regulating. And that turned out to become a real problem, because in other words, you had the fox in charge of the hen house. You shouldn't have a regulatory agency that also has the same or the mission of also promoting that technology, because that leads to a conflict of interest. And we've seen that today with the Federal Aviation Administration, where that is another agency that has both a promotional and a regulatory mission, and it's led to being too cozy with the industry, and as a result has led to fiascos like the 737 MAX 9 disaster. So in 1975, when there was a good government movement in the aftermath of Watergate, Congress split up the Atomic Energy Commission into what is today the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission was established as an independent regulatory agency that did not have a promotional mission. Its goal was to ensure public health and safety and environmental protection. And that has worked relatively well over the years, and other countries admire and have modeled or try to model their own regulatory system after that, where they can. In a democracy, it may be possible to establish this independent regulator. But what the Atomic Energy Advancement Act would do would change the mission of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and force it to consider what they call the benefits of nuclear energy in its regulatory decisions. And that, I think, would take us back to the bad old days of the Atomic Energy Commission, where you're introducing this conflict of interest again. And I don't think, given the more than 300 members of the House who voted in favor of it, I'm really not sure how much they understood the full implications of what they were voting for, frankly.
So I am very excited to agree with you, Ed, on this point. I don't want to see NRC's mission changed. I think it's really important that we have an independent safety regulator. And I did want to point out that the Senate's version of the bill, which is called the Advance Act, which passed last July, does not have that mission change. And so we'll see what happens in the negotiation and the conferencing. But hopefully we can get a bill that has, the good provisions. There's things like money towards uranium mine cleanup on indigenous lands that's in the Advance Act. We really want to see that go through. And some of the other provisions that address environmental justice issues, address some of these safety provisions. And I don't think we need that NRC mission change, and it could be very harmful to the industry's reputation. So 100% agree with you there.
So thanks to our panel guests for being here. Thank you, Edwin. Thank you, Jessica and Narati.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It's actually,
yeah, thanks for having us.
It was very nice to have your knowledge for this week's episodes. I'll let Olivia take it away from here.
Yeah, again, thank you so much. It was a great conversation. For all of us listening, follow this podcast and other podcasts from our national conversation. You can find us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and everywhere podcasts can be found. Follow Our National Conversation on TikTok and Instagram at Our National Conversation, and on Twitter at our NATL Convo. Finally, visit our website at ournationalconversation.org. And if you want to tune in again next week, we're talking about women's health. So hopefully we'll see y'all there.